5 years, 1112 days behind glass. She walked out expecting no one. Instead, she saw her daughter, standing beside a stranger, a man she had never met in her life. But here's what nobody expected. That stranger wasn't just some kind soul who'd offered a ride. He was the reason her daughter had a home to grow up in at all. And what he was about to hand her, in a plain manila envelope, would explain 5 years of silence she never understood. Selena Marsh was 29 years old the night everything in her life changed. Standing in the passenger seat of a car she should never have been in. Arrested alongside a boyfriend running a small-time check fraud operation, she swore. In every interview and every court appearance that followed, she'd had no real knowledge of. The evidence against her was thin, circumstantial, built largely on the fact that her name appeared as a joint account holder on paperwork she'd signed, without reading closely, trusting a man who turned out not to deserve that trust at all. Her public defender, overworked and juggling triple the caseload any single attorney should carry, recommended a plea deal that shaved years off a maximum sentence in exchange for a guaranteed 5-year term. Terrified, exhausted, and drowning in a system that moves fast when it wants to, and impossibly slow when it doesn't, Selena took the deal. Her daughter, Ava, was 4 years old at the time, too young to understand where her mother had gone, only that one day she was there, and the next day she simply wasn't. Selena had no family capable of taking Ava in. Her own mother had passed years earlier. Her sister was struggling with her own instability 2 states away, and Ava's father had never been part of the picture at all. For the first several agonizing weeks, Ava moved through the emergency foster system, the exact outcome Selena had lain awake, dreading every night since her arrest. What Selena didn't know, sitting in a cell reading letters from a caseworker that grew shorter and more clinical each month, was that a man named Walter Grimes, a 61-year-old retired mechanic, who had lived 3 doors down from her apartment for over a decade, had shown up at the county family services office within days of Ava entering the system. Walter had known Selena only as a friendly, hard-working neighbor who occasionally let him borrow tools, and he'd known Ava mostly as the small girl who waved at him from the sidewalk every morning on her way to preschool. He had no legal obligation to either of them. He wasn't family. He wasn't even particularly close to Selena, beyond neighborly courtesy. But Walter had lost his own daughter to a car accident 11 years earlier, a loss that had hollowed out a particular room in his life he'd never quite found a way to fill again. And something about watching a 4-year-old girl disappear into an overwhelmed foster system, alone and frightened, had moved him to do something he'd never done before in his life. He petitioned for kinship-adjacent emergency guardianship, a difficult, unusual, uphill legal process for a non-relative, and after 8 grueling weeks of paperwork, home inspections, and a caseworker, initially skeptical of an unrelated older man's motives, he won. Selena learned about Walter's guardianship through a single, brief letter from her caseworker roughly 2 months into her sentence, a letter that offered almost no detail beyond the bare fact that Ava had been placed with a family friend rather than in continued foster care. Prison visitation was limited, complicated by distance, and by a facility that made family contact deliberately difficult to navigate. Over 5 years, Selena received exactly 6 in-person visits from Ava, each one shorter and more disorienting than the last, her daughter growing older and more like a stranger with every visit, always accompanied by an older man Selena barely knew, beyond his name and his kind, tired eyes. What she didn't was how much that man had actually sacrificed to make even those 6 visits happen at all. And then, it all changed. The morning of Selena's release arrived gray and quiet, fog settling low across the parking lot, outside the correctional facility, as she signed the final release paperwork with hands that hadn't stopped shaking since sunrise. She had told herself repeatedly, over the past several weeks, not to expect anyone waiting for her. Her caseworker inside had warned her, gently but clearly, that Walter's guardianship of Ava had legal complexities that might not simply dissolve the moment she walked free. Custody, Transitions after long incarcerations rarely happened as quickly or simply as people hoped. So when Selena pushed through the facility's exit doors and saw two figures standing at the edge of the parking lot, she nearly didn't register what she was looking at. A girl, 9 years old now, tall and unfamiliar in a way that made Selena's chest physically ache. This wasn't the round-faced 4-year-old she'd left behind. This was someone almost entirely new, shaped by 5 years Selena hadn't been present for, and beside her, a man she recognized only from those 6 brief, disorienting visitation sessions, Walter Grimes, standing with his hands folded in front of him, patient, unassuming, watching Selena's face with an expression that seemed almost apologetic for existing in this moment at all. Ava let go of Walter's hand and ran. Selena dropped to her knees on the wet pavement as Ava crashed into her, both of them holding on, with the particular desperation of 5 lost years, compressed into a single embrace, Selena sobbing in a way she hadn't allowed herself to in the entire duration of her sentence, terrified that if she started, she'd never stop. When she finally looked up, Walter had approached slowly, respectfully, a worn manila envelope held in both hands. "I know this is a lot," he said quietly. "I'm not here to complicate anything. I just need you to have this before you decide anything about what happens next." Selena, still holding Ava tightly with one arm, took the envelope with trembling fingers. "What is this?" "Everything," Walter said simply. "Every guardianship filing, every school record, every doctor's visit, every letter I wrote to the facility, asking them to approve another visit when they kept denying us. I kept it all, because I always thought you deserved to see it, whenever this day came." Selena opened the envelope right there in the parking lot, and what she found inside stopped her breath entirely. Inside were dozens of documents, guardianship renewal filings, each one requiring Walter to justify, year after year, why an unrelated 60-something man should retain custody of a young girl, not his own. There were medical records showing he'd covered Ava's dental surgery out of his own modest retirement savings when insurance complications delayed approval. There were school records showing his signature on every parent-teacher conference form for 5 consecutive years, and near the bottom, a stack of returned, denied visitation request letters, nearly 30 of them, spanning the entire 5 years, each one a formal request for an additional visit beyond the facility's minimum allowance, each one denied due to overcrowded scheduling, each one resubmitted anyway. "You tried this many times," Selena said, her voice barely above a whisper, flipping through letter after letter with Ava still pressed against her side. "For 5 years. For someone else's kid." "She wasn't someone else's kid to me," Walter said, his own voice catching slightly. "Not after the first few months. I know that's not my place to say. I know you're her mother, and nothing changes that. And I never once tried to make her forget you. I promise you that. I made sure she knew your face, your voice, your letters, every single day. But somewhere in those 5 years, she became mine to protect too. And I wasn't going to let a scheduling office decide how much of you she got to keep." Selena sat back on her heels in that gray parking lot, envelope open in her lap, her daughter's arms still wrapped around her, and felt something complicated settle in her chest. Grief for the years she'd lost, gratitude toward a man who owed her nothing, and a quiet, overwhelming realization that her daughter hadn't simply survived those 5 years. She had been genuinely, thoroughly loved through every single one of them, by someone who had no obligation to give that love at all. The 3 of them sat together in Walter's car in that parking lot for nearly an hour, before anyone suggested actually driving anywhere. Selena reading through documents with Ava, curled against her shoulder, occasionally pointing at a school photo or a doctor's note and explaining, in a 9-year-old's careful detail, what had actually happened during a particular stretch of time her mother had missed. "Mr. Walter taught me to ride a bike," Ava said at one point, tapping a photograph of herself on a small blue bicycle, training wheels still attached. "He fell over trying to teach me. He's really bad at it, actually." "I am extremely bad at it," Walter agreed solemnly. And for the first time since walking out of that facility, Selena laughed. A real laugh, surprised out of her, the sound cracking something loose in her chest, that had been clenched tight for 5 years. The legal transition of custody back to Selena took another several weeks to formally process, a period Walter insisted on making as gentle as possible, refusing to treat the handoff as an ending rather than a continuation. He helped Selena find a small apartment near his own house, quietly co-signed the lease when post-incarceration record made most landlords hesitant, and made it clear, without ever making it a condition, that he intended to remain in both their lives for as long as they wanted him there. The meaning moment came about 4 months later, on a Sunday afternoon, when Selena stood in her own small kitchen watching through the window as Walter, in her tiny backyard, attempted once again, and failed once again, to teach Ava how to properly balance on that same blue bicycle, both of them laughing so hard, neither one noticed Selena watching from the doorway, tears sliding down her face for reasons that had nothing to do with grief anymore. "I spent 5 years terrified she'd forget me," Selena said later that evening, sitting with Walter on his porch, after Ava had fallen asleep. "I never once considered that someone might love her enough to make sure she didn't." "She never forgot you," Walter said quietly. "Not for a single day. I made sure of that. But I won't pretend I wasn't scared too. Scared she'd only ever think of me as the man who filled in the gap. Turns out, gaps can hold real love too. Doesn't have to be a lesser kind. Only